The air in Silas Blackwood's machine shed was thick with the ghosts of harvests past. It smelled of settled dust, stale diesel, and the faint metallic tang of cold steel. It was a scent of security, a scent of ownership. But that morning, it was tainted by the cloying sweetness of cheap cologne and the sour aroma of bad news. Mr. Henderson, the vice president from the Farmers and Merchants Bank, stood with his polished city shoes planted carefully on the oil-stained concrete, a clipboard held like a shield against his chest. He was a man made of soft hands and starched collars, and he looked as out of place in that shed as a tuxedo at a hog wrestling contest. "It's a fine piece of property, Silas," Henderson said, his voice smooth but carrying an edge that could strip paint. "A real shame it's come to this." He gestured vaguely at the fields visible through the wide-open doors, fields that had been in the Blackwood family since the government first carved up the prairie. Silas didn't say anything. He just stood with his arms crossed, his work-worn hands resting on the thick flannel of his shirt. His gaze was fixed on the banker, steady and unblinking, the way a man watches a hawk circling his chickens. He'd seen Henderson's kind before. They came with smiles and promises when they wanted you to sign on the dotted line, and they came with clipboards and veiled threats when they wanted you out. Henderson's eyes swept the shed, cataloguing the assets. His lips curled into a faint sneer as he took in the collection of machinery. An old Farmall M, its red paint faded to a dull orange, sat next to a John Deere 4020 that had seen better days but still ran like a top. A New Holland baler, the kind you had to wrestle with, was tucked in a corner. It was a lineup from a different era. Solid, dependable, and, most importantly, paid for. "Frankly, Silas," the banker continued, tapping a pen against his clipboard, "this equipment, it's not going to bring much at auction. It's antiquated. Obsolete." His gaze finally landed on the behemoth that took up the entire back bay of the shed, a creature of shadow and sheer mass. It was a Steiger Panther II, its industrial green paint scarred and faded, its massive dual tires holding the weight of nearly 20 tons of American iron. The articulated steering joint was greasy, the windows were dusty, but it sat with the quiet dignity of a retired champion. "And that thing," Henderson scoffed, "a relic. You'd have been better off trading that in 10 years ago on a new Versatile or a Deere, something with a warranty, something with value." Silas's jaw tightened, but his voice remained level. "That tractor doesn't have a note on it, Mr. Henderson. It's mine. Just like the 4020. Just like the M. Just like this land. The land has a mortgage, Silas, and the operating loan for this past spring's inputs is past due. The board has made its decision. We're calling the note. The auction is set for the first week of November, after you get the crop off." Henderson gave a thin, predatory smile. "We have to protect the bank's interests, you understand?" Silas understood perfectly. He understood that land prices had nearly tripled in the last 5 years. He understood his neighbor, Dale Peterson, had been expanding aggressively, buying up every parcel he could get his hands on with money borrowed from Henderson's bank. And he understood that his 320 acres, sitting right between two of Peterson's largest tracts, was the prize Henderson intended to deliver. The past-due operating loan was just the excuse, the crowbar to pry him off his own ground. "You'll get your money for the operating loan," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "I'll have the crop out." "I'm sure you will," Henderson said, his tone dripping with condescension. He made a few more notes on his clipboard, his pen scratching loudly in the quiet shed. "The auctioneer will be out next month to inventory and tag the equipment. Try not to break anything before then." With a final dismissive glance at the old Steiger, the banker turned and walked out into the bright September sunlight, his city shoes leaving clean, sharp prints in the dust of the farmyard. Silas watched him go, watched the new Buick sedan kick up a cloud of gravel as it sped down the lane. He stood there for a long time, the silence of the shed settling back around him. He walked over to the Steiger, the sheer size of it blocking out the light from the door. He ran a hand over the massive fender, the steel cool and solid beneath his calloused palm. Henderson saw a relic. Dale Peterson, who drove by daily in his brand-new, air-conditioned International 1466, saw a joke. The other farmers at the co-op saw a stubborn old fool who refused to get with the times. But Silas saw something else. He saw the 10,000 hours he'd put on that machine himself after buying it for cash from a retiring farmer up in North Dakota. He saw the Caterpillar 3306 engine he'd rebuilt with his own two hands one bitter winter. He saw the hydraulic lines he'd replaced, the transmission he'd babied, the frame he knew was solid as bedrock. He saw a tool, a paid-for tool, and in the quiet gears and cold steel of that old green monster, he saw his only way out. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of what Silas did next, I want to ask you all something. Have you ever had a piece of equipment, a truck, a tool, anything, that everyone else called junk, but you knew its real worth? Maybe it was an old Ford pickup your granddad gave you, or a chainsaw that was ugly but always started. Let me know down in the comments what it was and why it was special to you. Alright, let's get back to it. The week after Henderson's visit, the weather turned. A cold front swept down from Canada, bringing with it a damp, persistent chill that promised an early frost. For Silas, it was a starting gun. The auction in November was a finish line he couldn't afford to cross without a fight. His weapon of choice sat silent, waiting for his command. He spent the first day not in the field, but in the shed. He rolled back the heavy doors and let the pale autumn light spill over the Steiger. The work began with air filters. He pulled the massive canister, blew it out with the air compressor until a cloud of dust and chaff filled the air, then meticulously cleaned the housing before seating it back in place. Next came the fuel filters. He cracked the bleeders, the smell of diesel sharp and clean, catching the runoff in an old coffee can. He spun on two new filters, their white paint a stark contrast to the grime-caked engine block, and tightened them down with a filter wrench, giving it that final grunt of effort that seated the gasket just right. He moved on to the engine oil, the lifeblood of the big cat. He slid under the tractor on a piece of cardboard, the cold concrete seeping through his overalls. He found the massive drain plug, put a 5-gallon bucket under it, and put his weight into the wrench. The plug broke free with a groan, and a torrent of thick black oil gushed out, hot and smelling of a season's hard work. While it drained, he checked every grease zerk on the articulation joint and the axles, pumping fresh grease in until the old, dirty stuff squeezed out. It was a ritual, a conversation with the machine. Dale Peterson drove by as Silas was wrestling the new 5-gallon pail of Shell Rotella up to the fill port on the engine. Dale slowed his shiny new IH-1086, the cab clean and quiet, the radio likely playing some country station. He leaned out the window, a smirk on his face. "Still trying to keep that museum piece running, Silas?" He yelled over the quiet hum of his own tractor. "You know, for what you're spending on oil and filters, you could make the down payment on a real tractor." Silas just nodded, not giving him the satisfaction of a reply. He tipped the heavy pail, the clean amber oil glugging into the engine's heart. Dale shook his head, laughed, and sped off, his big radial tires throwing clods of dirt onto the shoulder of the road. The scorn was as thick as the morning fog, but Silas let it roll off him. He had work to do. The real test came when he climbed into the cab. The seat was cracked vinyl, the controls were a series of heavy mechanical levers, not the fancy hydraulic joysticks of Dale's new rig. He turned the key. The starter motor groaned, a deep guttural sound that seemed to shake the whole shed. The big 6-cylinder diesel engine turned over once, twice, then coughed to life in a plume of black smoke that billowed out the stack and momentarily blotted out the sun. The engine settled into a low, loping idle, each cylinder firing with the rhythmic power of a locomotive. It wasn't a quiet purr, it was a declaration. It was the sound of raw, unadulterated horsepower. He spent the next 2 weeks in the field, pulling a 30-foot chisel plow, the Steiger's 8 massive tires biting into the corn stubble. The ground was hard and dry, but the old tractor didn't complain. It just dug in, the cat engine finding its rhythm under load, the turbocharger whistling its high, lonely song across the prairie. Silas worked from sunup to sundown, stopping only for fuel and a quick sandwich he ate in the cab. One afternoon, disaster struck. He was on his last pass in the far 80 when he felt a shudder through the frame, followed by a sudden loss of power to the steering. He looked back and saw a shimmering spray of oil coating the ground behind him. A main hydraulic hose on the articulation joint had burst. He was miles from the shed with a tractor that could no longer turn. He shut it down, the sudden silence deafening. For a moment, a wave of despair washed over him. This was what Henderson and Peterson were counting on. A breakdown he couldn't fix, a delay he couldn't afford. He could see Dale's new tractor working under bright halogen lights across the fence line, moving steadily, relentlessly. But despair was a luxury, and Silas was a man of simple means. He climbed down, the stench of hot hydraulic fluid thick in the air. He found the split in the hose, a clean rupture near a rusty fitting. He walked the 2 miles back to his farmstead in the growing twilight. He didn't call for help. He didn't have anyone to call. In his workshop, he found a length of hydraulic hose and the fittings he needed. He'd bought them years ago, just in case. He gathered his wrenches, a bucket, and a handful of rags, and walked the 2 miles back out to the crippled machine. He worked by the light of a single flashlight, his knuckles getting scraped and bloody as he fought with the massive oil-slicked fittings. The night grew cold, and the coyotes began to yip in the distance. Across the way, Dale finished his field and headed home, his tractor's lights disappearing over the rise. Silas was alone in the dark, covered in oil, fighting to save his farm with a set of old wrenches and a sheer refusal to quit. By the time the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky, he had the new hose on. He topped off the hydraulic fluid, climbed back into the cab, and turned the key. The engine roared back to life. He tested the steering. It was stiff, but it held. He finished the last pass as the sun came up, a solitary, defiant figure against the morning sky. The fall of 1978 was a golden one for farmers in the heartland. Corn prices were strong, soybeans were even better, and the talk at the grain elevator was all about expansion. The government was pushing for it, the banks were practically giving money away, and the gospel of fence-row to fence-row was preached from every co-op and auction house in the county. It was a time of boundless optimism, a boom fueled by high commodity prices and easy credit. Dale Peterson was the poster child for this new era. He'd leveraged his initial success and, with Henderson's enthusiastic backing, bought another quarter section of land that bordered Silas's property. To work the new ground, he traded in his 2-year-old IH-1466 for the biggest, most powerful machine International Harvester had to offer. A brand new 2+2, the Snoopy tractor, with its long nose and cab set back over the rear axle. It was the talk of the township. It had air conditioning, a radio, and more horsepower than Dale knew what to do with. He paraded it past Silas's place the day he brought it home from the dealer. Silas was out by the mailbox and watched it come down the road, the engine a high-tech whine compared to his Steiger's guttural roar. Dale pulled over, the hydraulics hissing as he lowered the new 12-bottom plow to the ground for effect. "What do you think of that, Silas?" Dale shouted from his climate-controlled cab. "This is how you get ahead in the modern world. You gotta invest in the best to be the best." Silas just looked at the massive piece of machinery. He could smell the new paint and the off-gassing of the new tires. He knew, without asking, that the payments on that rig were more than his entire farm's net income in a good year. "She's a big one, Dale," was all he said. Dale laughed, a booming, confident sound. "Damn right she is. Henderson at the bank says a man can't afford not to upgrade in times like these. Land values are only going one way, up." He put the tractor in gear and tore off down the road, leaving Silas in a cloud of dust and diesel exhaust fumes. Silas had a good year too, a very good year. The corn came in at 140 bushels to the acre, the best he'd ever had. The old 4020 ran the planter without a hiccup, and the Steiger pulled the harvest implements day and night. After his late-night repair in the field, the machine seemed to have a new sense of purpose, running stronger than it had in years. He got the crops harvested and hauled to the elevator well before the first snow. The check from the co-op was the biggest he'd ever held in his hand. The temptation was there. He could feel it, a low hum of desire in the back of his mind. He could walk into the John Deere dealership and put a down payment on a new 4440. He could buy a new pickup truck, one that didn't have rust on the fenders. He could finally be like Dale, seen as a success, a man on the move. Instead, he drove his old Ford F-150 into town, the one with the mismatched driver's side door, and walked into the Farmers and Merchants Bank. He bypassed the loan desks where men like Dale were signing their futures away and went straight to the teller. He paid off the remainder of his operating loan, every last cent, plus interest. The teller, a young woman who didn't know him, had to get Henderson to approve the transaction. The banker came out of his office, his face a mask of confusion and barely concealed disappointment. He'd been so sure Silas would default that the land would be his to sell. Paying it off? In full, Henderson asked, as if Silas were speaking a foreign language. That's right, Silas said, pushing the check across the counter. And the rest, he pointed to the remaining substantial balance on his statement, I'll take that in a cashier's check. With the bank's operating loan cleared and a hefty cashier's check in his pocket, Silas didn't go to the implement dealer. He went to the post office and bought US savings bonds. He put the rest in a passbook savings account at a different bank in the next town over. He paid his property taxes a year in advance. When he was done, his farm was free and clear of everything but the original mortgage on the land, and his operating debt was zero. He had a cushion. The community saw it as weakness. At the diner, the morning coffee drinkers whispered that old man Blackwood had lost his nerve. He had a windfall and buried it in a coffee can instead of putting it to work. Dale Peterson told everyone who would listen that Silas was a fool. He's letting his ground go to waste, Dale would say, gesturing with his fork. I'd have that money leveraged into another 160 acres by now. You can't make money by saving it, not with inflation running the way it is. The late 70s roared on. Inflation soared. President Carter was on the television talking about a crisis of confidence. The Federal Reserve, under a new chairman named Paul Volcker, started talking about jacking up interest rates to fight it. At the diner, the farmers complained about the cost of fuel and fertilizer, but the price of corn kept climbing and the banks kept lending. The prime interest rate, the rate banks charged their best customers, crept into the double digits, 12%, then 15%. Dale Peterson just laughed it off. It's a temporary thing, he told Henderson over a steak dinner. You gotta ride the wave. My variable rate loans will come back down. Land will never be cheaper than it is today. Henderson, pouring another glass of wine, agreed wholeheartedly. You're a visionary, Dale. These other old-timers like Silas, they're going to be left in the dust. That winter was long and cold. Silas spent most of it in his shed. He didn't do a major overhaul on the Steiger, just routine maintenance. He changed the fluids, checked the wiring, and cleaned the cab. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, he sat on an overturned bucket, just looking at the big green tractor. The wind howled, rattling the tin on the roof, but inside the shed it was quiet. The machine was silent, patient, asking for nothing. It owed no one, it waited. He'd heard the talk. He knew what they said about him. A failure, a man with no ambition. But as he ran a greasy rag over the big Caterpillar valve cover, he felt a deep sense of peace. The loud, confident talk of endless growth and easy money felt brittle to him, like a thin sheet of ice over a deep, cold lake. He didn't know when the ice would break, but he knew it would. And he knew that when it did, a man was better off standing on solid ground. He shut off the lights and walked back to the house through the deep snow, the only sound the crunch of his boots and the distant, mournful cry of the winter wind. A storm was coming, and it had nothing to do with the weather. The turn of the decade felt like a page turning in a book nobody wanted to read. The year 1980 arrived not with a roar of prosperity, but with the quiet, gnawing anxiety of a bad tooth. On the television, men in suits talked about a grain embargo against the Soviet Union, a geopolitical chess move that felt, to the men who grew the grain, like someone had just sawed the legs off their kitchen table. The price of corn, which had been the foundation of so much confident borrowing, began to soften, then sag, then plummet. At the same time, the other shoe dropped. The prime interest rate, a number most farmers only vaguely paid attention to, suddenly became the headline. It climbed with terrifying speed from the high teens into the 20s. 21%. It was an impossible, suffocating number. For men like Dale Peterson, who had signed his life away on variable rate loans, every tick upward was another shovelful of dirt on his coffin. The first sign of real trouble for Dale appeared during planting season. His magnificent international 2+2, the symbol of his modern empire, suddenly went lame in the middle of his biggest field. A complex electrical problem in the transmission controller left it dead in the water. Dale, who knew his way around a simple diesel engine, stared at the spaghetti of wires and circuit boards with the baffled frustration of a man trying to read Greek. He had to call the dealer. The mechanic, already swamped with calls from other farmers with similar high-tech problems, couldn't get there for 3 days. 3 critical days of planting season were lost. The bill for the service call and the new controller cost more than Silas spent on fuel for the entire month. Silas saw it from his own tractor seat. He was in the field next door, planting soybeans with his old John Deere 4020. The 4020 was a simple beast of levers and gears. When a hydraulic line started weeping, Silas shut it down, drove back to his shed, cut a new length of hose from a bulk roll he kept on hand, crimped on new fittings with a tool he'd owned for 20 years, and was back in the field in under an hour. He watched Dale pace around his silent red giant, a prisoner of his own progress. The drought that summer was the final merciless blow. The sky turned a hard metallic blue and stayed that way for weeks. The corn stalks, which should have been shoulder-high by July, were stunted and yellowed. The leaves curled inward during the day, a desperate attempt to hold on to what little moisture they had. The ground cracked open in patterns like broken pottery. For Dale, the drought was a catastrophe. He had borrowed heavily to pay for the seed, the fertilizer, the chemicals, all priced for a bumper crop that would never come. Now he had a mountain of debt, serviced by a 21% interest rate, and a crop that might not even pay for the cost of harvesting it. Silas's fields suffered too. His corn was just as short, his beans just as sparse. But his equation was different. His inputs were paid for with cash from his savings. His machinery had no payments. His break-even point was a fraction of Dale's. He would lose money on the year, but it would be a manageable loss, a dip into the cushion he had so carefully built. For Dale, it was a bottomless pit. The talk at the diner changed. The confident boasting about land prices and new equipment was gone, replaced by hushed, fearful conversations about who was getting letters from the bank. Dale Peterson stopped coming in for morning coffee altogether. He was seen driving his pickup late at night, his face illuminated by the dashboard lights, looking like a ghost haunting his own land. One evening in late August, Silas was working in his shed, replacing the bearings on his combine's feeder house. He heard a vehicle pull into his yard and shut off. A moment later, Dale Peterson was standing in the wide-open doorway, silhouetted against the dying light. He looked 10 years older than he had that spring. His eyes were hollow, his shoulders slumped. "Silas," he said, his voice raspy. He held a greasy hydraulic cylinder in his hands. "It's off my disc. The packing's shot. The dealer says it'll be 2 weeks to get a new kit." Silas wiped his hands on a rag and walked over, taking the cylinder. He looked at it, turning it over in his hands. It was a standard 3-inch bore cylinder, the kind used on a dozen different implements. 2 weeks? Silas asked, raising an eyebrow. Dale just nodded, looking at the ground. "They don't stock much anymore. Have to order everything in." Silas walked over to a dusty set of metal shelves in the corner of his shed. He rummaged through a few cardboard boxes, the sound of clanking metal echoing in the quiet. He pulled out a small plastic bag containing a set of new seals and wipers. "This ought to do it," he said, tossing the bag to Dale. "Got a couple sets a few years back at a farm sale. Never know when you'll need one." Dale stared at the bag in his hand as if it were a miracle. "What do I owe you?" "Nothing," Silas said, turning back to his combine. "Just get your disc fixed." Dale stood there for a long moment, the plastic bag crinkling in his fist. He opened his mouth to say something else, but no words came out. He just turned and walked back to his truck, the weight of the world still on his shoulders, but maybe, just for a moment, an ounce or two lighter. Silas heard the truck start and drive away. He didn't look up, but he knew. The cracks in Dale's world were spreading, and it was only a matter of time before the whole thing came crashing down. The fall of 1982 felt like a long, slow funeral. The harvest was grim. Yields were half of what they should have been, and prices were in the tank. The countryside was filled with the rumble of combines and the sight of farmers working with a quiet, desperate intensity, trying to salvage what they could from a disastrous year. But the real horror wasn't in the fields, it was in the mailboxes. The letters from the banks arrived in plain white envelopes, but they felt as heavy as tombstones. They were filled with cold legal language, demand for payment, foreclosure proceedings, liquidation of assets. The first auction sign went up on the Miller Place, down on the county line, a white sign with stark black letters nailed to a fence post. It was like seeing a disease manifest itself, a visible symptom of the sickness that was consuming them all. Soon there was another on the Jensen farm, and then another on the Olsons. Silas drove past them on his way to town, his heart aching for his neighbors. He knew these families. He'd helped them bale hay, celebrated their children's weddings, mourned their parents' passing. Now their lives were being dismantled, piece, by forces they couldn't control. The inevitable letter arrived at Dale Peterson's farm just before Thanksgiving. Silas saw the bank car, Mr. Henderson's new Lincoln, parked in Dale's driveway one afternoon. He didn't stay long. Later that day, Silas saw Dale's wife, Mary, out by the clothesline, not hanging laundry, but just standing there, her face buried in her hands, her body shaking with sobs. The auction sign went up on Dale's fence the following Monday. The date was set for the second Saturday in December. The news spread through the township like a prairie fire. Dale Peterson, the man who had represented the pinnacle of modern aggressive farming, had fallen. His failure was a terrifying symbol for everyone else who was hanging on by a thread. Silas continued his work, his routine a shield against the chaos. He finished his harvest, the old Steiger pulling the grain cart without a single complaint. He put his machinery away for the winter, greasing every fitting, changing every drop of oil, preparing for a spring he hoped would come. He was surviving. He wasn't thriving, not by any means, but his foundation was solid. He had no operating loans breathing down his neck. The only check he wrote to a bank was the small, steady mortgage payment on the land, a payment he could easily make from his savings. His survival was quiet, almost invisible. He wasn't immune to the pain around him. He saw it in the strained faces at the co-op, felt it in the empty pews at church. He started buying his groceries in the next town over, just to avoid the possibility of running into Mary Peterson and seeing the shame and despair in her eyes. One raw, cold afternoon, a week before the auction, Silas was in his workshop, sharpening the blades for his sickle mower. He heard the crunch of tires on the frozen gravel of his driveway. It was Dale. He got out of his truck and walked slowly toward the shed, his movements stiff and uncertain. "Silas," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "the bank's man was out, tagging everything. He put a tag on my father's old toolbox." Dale's voice broke. "The red one, the Kennedy. Dad bought it the year I was born. It's got all his old tools in it. My tools." He looked at Silas, his eyes pleading. "They're going to sell it. For 10, maybe $20, to some stranger." Silas put down the file he was holding. He looked at the man before him, a man stripped of all his pride, all his confidence. He wasn't seeing the arrogant neighbor who had mocked his old equipment. He was seeing a farmer who was losing his history, his identity. "They can't do that, can they?" Dale asked, a desperate hope in his voice. "It's personal property, isn't it?" Silas knew the hard truth. When the bank foreclosed, everything was an asset. Personal or not, if it had value, it was on the list. "The loan documents you signed, Dale, they probably had a clause covering all property, not just the machinery." Dale's face crumpled. He leaned against the doorframe of the shed, the fight completely gone out of him. "Everything," he choked out. "They're taking everything." Silas stood there, the cold December air biting at his face. He looked past Dale, toward the fields that were now blanketed in a thin layer of snow. He looked at his own machinery, silent and secure in the shed. The Steiger, the 40-20, the old Farmall M. They were more than just iron. They were his freedom. They were the reason he was standing here, on his own 2 feet, while his neighbor's world was being sold out from under him. In that moment, he felt no triumph, no satisfaction of being right. All he felt was a profound and terrible sadness. The day of the Peterson auction dawned grey and bitter, with a wind that cut through a man's coat like a surgeon's knife. The farmyard was packed with pickup trucks, their exhaust pipes pluming white steam into the frozen air. The entire community was there, not with the eager energy of a typical farm sale, but with the somber reverence of a wake. They were there to watch a neighbor's life be sold off and to wonder whose would be next. The auctioneer, a man with a booming voice and a sad smile, stood on a flatbed trailer, trying to work up some enthusiasm. But the crowd was quiet, their hands stuffed in their pockets, their faces grim. Henderson was there, standing off to the side, his city overcoat looking thin and inadequate against the prairie cold. He wasn't the confident predator Silas remembered, he looked nervous and beleaguered. A man just trying to staunch the bleeding from his bank's balance sheet. They started with the big items. The massive IH2+2, once the pride of the county, was driven before the crowd. It looked forlorn, its bright red paint seeming to mock the occasion. The bidding was sluggish, pathetic. The tractor that Dale had paid over $100,000 for just a few years ago sold for less than $30,000. Henderson flinched with every low bid, the bank taking a catastrophic loss. The story was the same for the big new combine, the 12-bottom plow, the 24-row planter. The symbols of Dale's ambition were being sold for pennies on the dollar, their value erased by the very economic collapse they had helped to create. Silas stood at the back of the crowd, a silent observer. He didn't bid on any of the big machinery. He had no need for it and no desire to profit from his neighbor's ruin. He watched Dale and Mary standing near their house, huddled together, their faces ashen. They looked like strangers on their own farm. The auctioneer moved on to the smaller items, the tools and shop equipment. Finally, he got to the toolbox. "All right, folks, here we have a fine Kennedy machinist's box full of tools. Who'll give me $50 to start it?" $50. Silence. No one wanted to be the one to take a man's tools. $20 then. Give me 20, the auctioneer pleaded. A hand went up from a stranger near the front. 20. I got 20, who'll give me 30? From the back of the crowd, Silas's voice, calm and clear, cut through the cold air. $100. A hush fell over the yard, heads turned. $100 for an old toolbox was an absurd bid. The auctioneer, surprised, pointed toward Silas. "I have $100 from the man in the back. Do I hear 110? The stranger who bid 20 shook his head and dropped his hand. The auctioneer scanned the crowd. Sold for $100 to Silas Blackwood. Silas made his way to the clerk's table, paid his money in cash, and walked over to the toolbox. He didn't open it. He just picked it up, the weight of it familiar and solid, and started walking toward Dale. Dale saw him coming, and his face hardened with a mixture of shame and anger. "What are you doing, Silas? You here to gloat? To buy my life for scrap?" Silas stopped in front of him and set the heavy toolbox down on the frozen ground. "No, Dale," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm here to give you back your tools." Dale stared at him, then at the toolbox, his mind struggling to comprehend. "But it doesn't, you just bought it." "I bought it so the bank couldn't," Silas said. "A man needs his tools. Whatever you do next, wherever you go, you'll need these." He looked Dale square in the eye. "This isn't yours anymore," he said, gesturing to the farmyard where the auctioneer's chant droned on. "But this," he tapped the top of the red metal box. This is your father's and yours." Mary started to cry, silent tears streaming down her face. Dale stood frozen for a moment, his tough facade finally cracking. His body shuddered, and a single ragged sob escaped him. He reached out and put a hand on Silas's shoulder, his grip tight. "Thank you, Silas," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." A few weeks later, after the Petersons had moved away to live with Mary's sister in the city, Silas got a call from Mr. Henderson. The banker's voice was stripped of all its former arrogance. It was the voice of a man on the ropes. The bank was in deep trouble, holding the deeds to half a dozen farms they couldn't sell. Land that had been valued at $2,000 an acre 2 years ago couldn't find a buyer at $600. "Silas," Henderson said, "the bank has taken ownership of the Peterson Quarter section, the one that borders your east field. We need to get it off our books before the regulators come in. We need a cash sale." He paused. "I know you don't carry debt, that you're conservative. I can let it go for 500 an acre. Cash. It was a staggering price, a fraction of its recent value. Silas thought of the savings bonds he'd bought that day in 1978, the money everyone said he was a fool to squirrel away. They had been sitting there, quietly earning interest, waiting for a storm. The storm had come and gone, and now was the time. I'll take it, Silas said simply. He expanded his farm not at the peak of the market with a mountain of debt, but at the very bottom with cash he had patiently saved. The community, what was left of it, saw it happen. The whispers at the diner were different now. They spoke of Silas Blackwood with a newfound respect, a kind of awe. He wasn't the stubborn old fool who resisted progress. He was the wise man who had seen the truth, the one who understood that the real foundation of a farm wasn't the size of its tractors, but the absence of its debts. Years passed, the land healed, and so did the people. The 1990s brought better prices and a cautious stability. Silas never got any bigger. He farmed his original 320 acres and the 160 he'd bought from the bank, and that was enough. He grew older, his movements slower, his hands more gnarled, but his eyes held the same steady calm. His grandson, a boy named Thomas, grew up in the shadow of the old Steiger. From the time he was big enough to climb the ladder, he rode in the cab with his grandfather. It was a loud, rattling, bare-bones classroom. There was no buddy seat, just a spot on the floor with a folded-up jacket for a cushion. There, Silas taught him about farming. He didn't teach him about maximizing yields or leveraging assets. He taught him how to listen to an engine, how to tell by the sound if it was happy or strained. He taught him how to rebuild a carburetor and how to splice a wire. One crisp fall evening, when Thomas was 16, they were standing in the shed after a long day of harvest. The boy was looking at the Steiger, its green paint almost completely worn away on the fenders, its massive tires cracked with age. "Grandpa," he asked, "why did you never buy a new tractor? After the crisis, you could have bought anything you wanted." Silas ran a hand over the cool steel of the fender, a gesture he had made 1,000 times. "This old tractor taught me the most important lesson there is, son," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It's not about having the newest or the biggest. It's about owning what you have. This machine, it never sent me a bill. It never threatened to take my land. It only asked for fuel, oil, and a little bit of care. In the hardest times, when everyone else's fancy new equipment was dragging them under, this old thing was my anchor." He looked at his grandson, his gaze serious and kind. "Remember that, Thomas. Debt is a cruel master. It makes you work for the bank, not for yourself. It makes you pray for rain and curse the markets. But when you're free and clear," he patted the tractor's fender again, "you're the one in charge. You can weather any storm." The boy nodded, the weight of the words settling on his young shoulders. He looked at the old green monster not as a relic, but as a testament, a monument of iron and wisdom. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the concrete floor, the Steiger Panther II stood silent, its work done, its lesson delivered, a quiet guardian of the land it had helped to save.